Does anyone want closed captioning?
No. It doesn't, if it doesn't hurt to start it. Yeah. Where is he? I think he stepped out.
How's the sound level? Can you hear me this morning?
Okay, try again, Jane, just to see if I can get it louder.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Does that sound good? Okay, I'm gonna make sure his volume's all the way up. Okay.
You're ready.
All right. I'll let them take the floor, Jane.
All right.
Good job, Maya.
I'm ready when you are. Are we set to go?
We got some people that are missing, Jane, but I will tell you, we talked about that list that I sent you last night.
Yeah.
We thought that if we could start off where we left off yesterday with the service animal topic, and then we'd like to move into the otherwise qualified lens. In our conversations, we did find that that was coming up often. So if we can move into that and then maybe go from there. Was there anything else, guys, that you wanted to focus on outside of those two things?
I think those were good. I think those, yeah.
So I think that's where everybody just basically wanted to start, and then time bearing, we can go from there. What do you think?
That's fine with me. And again, the rules are you can interrupt me anytime you want. So let's lay that out on the table. I will tell you the last thing on your list is the first thing I want to get rid of this morning, which is the access text situation and other ways we can now meet this need, because I don't know anything about it. So all I can tell you is you probably know more about the situation than I do. There's lots of seminars and webinars coming up free online that you can tap into. AHEAD has one coming up next week. One of the Kentucky AHEAD list published. They're doing something from from the government in the state of Kentucky, from their VR section. There are workshops out there that people are offering that talk about alternatives, but I know less about it than you do. So you're going to have to work those out for yourself and share those resources.
Awesome. Thank you, Jane.
Okay. With that having been said, let's talk about service animals. And I'm guessing that you really want to hear, what you really want to hear about is service animals in training. And in that regard, I have good news. I checked out this morning the state law, the South Dakota state laws regarding service animals in training. And you guys are off the hook.
Thought so.
The state statutes in South Dakota say, hold on a second. Excuse me. A service animal trainer may be accompanied by a service animal in training, wearing a collar and leash, harness, or cape that identifies the animal as a service animal in training in any of the places listed in 2013-23.1, subject to any conditions or limitations established by law and applicable to service animals, without being required to pay an extra charge for service animal training. That's the basic statute that says service animals in training are welcome in public places without being charged for it. They have the same rights in public places that a service animal would have, except that you've got to read further. You go back a step and there is a set of definitions. A service animal in training is defined in your state law. A service animal in training is defined as any dog undergoing individual training to provide specific disability-related work or service for an individual with a disability. Dogs are recognized as being in training to provide disability-specific assistance only after they have completed basic obedience training and are housebroken. Okay, that automatically leaves out the puppies. It leaves out the puppy raisers because they are by definition training all of those other things. And it says that training like the AKC good citizenship training for dogs and that kind of stuff, that is not a service animal in training if they're going through that kind of a training process. Only if they're being trained for disability related tasks. Now, it gets better. Just below what I just read you, there is a definition of a service animal trainer. A service animal trainer is any person who trains service animals for individuals with disabilities as an employee, contractor, or volunteer of a nationally recognized service animal training program. In other words, only professional trainers are recognized as being service animal trainers who are entitled to have those service animals in training properly identified in public. If that weren't enough, the first piece I read you said they're entitled to be in any of the places listed in 2013 23.1. Let's look at the places listed. Any person with a disability is entitled to reasonably equal accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of all hotels, lodging places, places of public accommodation, amusement or resort, and other places to which the general public is invited, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to all persons. Do you see anything in that definition that refers to either your classrooms or your residence halls? Because I sure don't.
No.
Bottom line is, in South Dakota, they will tell you that the ADA recognizes self-trained service animals, and that's absolutely true. But service animals in training are not given right of access in South Dakota unless they are with a professional service animal trainer working for a nationally recognized agency and properly identified as well. So if they want to bring the dog onto campus to train them in being around people and to crossing streets and dealing with crowds and that kind of thing as a professional trainer of a service dog, that's what the law applies to. It does not apply to students who say they are training their own service animal and want to have it with them on campus. And it does not apply to the ESA that you turn down on Friday that becomes a service animal in training on Monday morning. Doesn't work that way in South Dakota. You have legal impetus to say no. Okay, those are the rules. Now ask me about your specific situations.
Is there a way that you could send out a link to what you just read?
Yes, it comes from a website called that is www.animallaw.info. It used to be the Table of State Assistance Animal Laws. It comes out of Michigan State University and it lists all of the states. So you have to scroll down until you get to South Dakota, and it gives you the specifics in a chart, and then it refers you back to a page that is strictly about South Dakota. But if you Google Table of State Assistance Animal Laws, you'll get where you need to go.
Thank you.
So I think the first thing is the questions that came up. So say, assume that we have a service dog that meets the test. 2 questions have been tested. They meet the requirements to live on campus. What constitutes their access? There was questions about the res life and or in classrooms.
If it is truly a service dog, it's entitled to be with the individual in the same way that the individual is entitled to be in that classroom or in the residence hall in their wheelchair or wearing glasses. A service animal is not an accommodation. You don't get to say yes or no to an accommodation, to a service animal, in the way that you get to evaluate the request for a service animal. If it is in fact a service animal, then it's entitled to be anywhere the individual with a disability is entitled and appropriate to be. So for example, if you've got, this is a far out example, but I want to give that example. If you've got a student who is in a culinary arts program who has a service animal, they're allowed to have the service animal in the kitchen with them. If you have a student who has a service animal who is visiting a restaurant and patrons are not allowed in the kitchen, they can't be in the kitchen and their service animal can't be in the kitchen. So if it is truly a service animal, it's allowed to go anywhere that the person with the disability is allowed to go.
So can I ask you one more clarifying question about what you just said?
Sure.
So what I understand you to be saying is that a student who's not part of a nationally recognized training organization, just a student in the state of South Dakota cannot be recognized as a trainer of a service dog in training.
That's exactly right. Any student who tells you they are training their own service dog, the appropriate response would be, that's terrific. When it's trained, we'll welcome you and the service dog on campus. But as a service dog in training, it is not welcome on campus yet.
Same goes in the public service. So I run the testing center on campus. And I had somebody who came in to take an exam. When they scheduled, they said that they were bringing a service dog. When they got there, the animal was not trained. It was all up in my business. It was not trained. It might have been trained to do a task, but not fully trained. So when I said, I'm sorry, that the animal does not meet the test of being a trained service animal, and then they proceeded to say, well, it's in training. And I said, I appreciate that, but at this point in time, it's not conducive to this public space. So I had them leave and reschedule. And from the
And that's
sounds of
exactly
it-
right.
Sounds of it, that was legit.
So can you elaborate on, what if you have a student in a chemistry class and that lab, that requires certain cleanliness or things, or any other areas that would be questionable, to have an animal in it?
Okay. Let's talk about science labs separately from clinical settings, because there's two different sets of issues going on there. The service animal in a science lab brings up issues of safety for the animal and for everybody else. The service animal in clinical training sites, in medical facilities, brings up a whole different set of concerns as far as cleanliness and germs and whatever. So service animals in the science labs, if students are required to provide, to be gowned or to take special precautions as far as clothing and goggles and that kind of thing in order to be in that science lab, then it is not inappropriate to ask that the dog also be appropriately, I can't think of a word, but have the appropriate safety precautions for the dog too. There are things that you can get. There's something called doggles, which are safety glasses for dogs. There are paw things that you can put on the animal's paw so that they're not walking on a floor that might have chemicals spilled on it. You can Google that and find out all sorts of information about safety things for animals in lab settings. What if the question is raised as to whether having the animal in the lab setting would in fact throw off the restricted, I can't think how to describe it. If they're doing delicate research and they fear that the presence of the animal in that research lab may disrupt the environment and throw off the research. There aren't standard classes on up through chemistry 304 and whatever. Your standard classes aren't going to have that research lab issue. For those that do, for the few of you that have advanced biomedical laboratories and that kind of thing, where there is concerns about disrupting the environment for the testing that's going on, my best suggestion would be that you contact the science people, the association, I've lost the name of it. There is a group that does that deals with laboratories and training of service animals. I'm sorry, laboratories and training of students. The National Council of like chemistry professors and that kind of thing, the American Chemical Society, except there's a broader one that deals with all sciences. And they have put out rules and guidelines for how to deal with service animals. And it may be that if the research is that sensitive, that it is such a sterile environment, that there are all sorts of issues for people being in that environment. It may be that the decision is, in that particular case, the individual can't be in there with a service dog. Those are, based on my understanding, very rare exceptions. There's generally a way that you can protect the animal too, but those people have experience with that. It doesn't come up all that often. It's not worth losing sleep over.
So, sorry, go ahead now.
So we have it on our campus.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
On our campus, we have cadaver labs and we have a meat science lab where the students are butchering and processing livestock. I have historically said the service animals are not allowed in that space. Is that an incorrect judgment?
I would venture to guess that that is probably appropriate, that there is no way to maintain a sterile environment in that unique situation, and that some alternative should be gotten for the service animal. Again, I'm guessing that it doesn't come up all that often on your campus. And when it does, you deal with it on a one-up basis. And if you decide in your best judgment that it's not appropriate to allow the service animal in there because of fears of contamination, worst case scenario is that the student fights you, calls in Department of Justice, they come in and look at it and say, you made a mistake, and it should have been done this way instead. You do not get in trouble with the feds for making a reasoned decision, even if you make it wrong. You get in trouble for being arbitrary and capricious. So if you have good reason for saying what you're doing, and if your attorney says, I agree with you, I don't think this is healthy or safe or whatever, this is going to be our decision in these circumstances, then let the chips fall where they may. You always want to make sure that the people above you are going to back your decision. But once that comes to it, I don't think you have to abdicate common sense for fear of potentially crossing a line with the law. Do what makes logical sense and let it happen. As far as clinical settings are concerned, hospital settings and that kind of thing, there is really less fear of significant problems with a service dog in the hospital than there would be in a science lab where there's chemicals and things that could be contaminated, etc. If you are talking about taking a service animal into a room where everybody else, including all visitors and the hospital volunteers and everybody else, have to be gowned and gloved, and it's a very sterile environment because of the sensitive nature of that patient's illness, that's one thing. But generally in hospital settings and clinical settings, they don't inspect your clothes or your shoes or make you wash your hands before you're allowed into the hospital. The dog is no more likely to bring in contaminants than people who don't take good care of themselves and haven't showered in 3 days. Don't make problems for yourself if you don't have to. Okay?
Yeah.
Other questions about service animals?
Nope.
All right. Then you want to talk about otherwise qualified.
Now,
Otherwise qualified.
I don't know
I'm
if it
sorry.
helps at all, but we did have a scenario that came up. Would you want?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Based, or do you just want to start off with any basic information?
No, go with your scenario.
Kelly, you wanna? Oh, my student. So I am working with a student who is visually impaired. She is in an education program in college. She just completed her junior field experience in a classroom of 24 students, elementary school. She's a good student, sweet girl, but there are some concerns have been raised about her limitations in a public classroom setting. Primarily because she's not able to see her students. You know, if there's a question when they raise their hand, the biggest concern that has been brought up by her field supervisor is a safety concern. If she's not able to see that there's something brewing in the back of the classroom, how is she to respond? Which has then brought up a lot of questions for me and for her instructors on our campus about how can we accommodate her? And so, yeah, I guess it's just brought up a bunch of questions about, you know, is this something that she's able to do? You know, and I've had conversations about some potential assistive tech for her. But it really has just brought up a lot of questions for us on our responsibility to accommodate her in an internship, basically. So yeah, where I'm at.
Okay. That's a question about technical standards and about reasonable accommodations in that setting. It's not a question about otherwise qualified. And let me sort out the two for you.
Sure.
Otherwise qualified means with or without reasonable accommodation, the student meets all of the same requirements: academic, technical, professional, and behavioral requirements. This is a student you said, who is a good student. So academically, she meets it. Professionally, she's presenting herself in a professional way. Technical standards, that's the issue here, is can she do what you need to do in order to be a teacher in that setting? Behavioral standards, that's not an issue in this case either. But otherwise qualified, the statement from section 504 says no otherwise qualified person with a disability shall, solely on the basis of disability, be denied access. Otherwise, if you are not otherwise qualified, you are not entitled to accommodation under the law. Otherwise qualified suggests that the individual meets the same requirements to be in that situation, not how they perform in that situation, which is what your concerns are, but to actually be in that situation. I'm trying to think how to expand on this. Generally, we use the reference to otherwise qualified in the context of admission to a program, an institution, or an activity. And on the list of concerns that Jennifer sent me yesterday, it's got, how will this specifically be impacted with our upcoming open admissions? Are all of your schools going to open admissions? What's the story there?
Board of Regents is, from the buzzwords going around, so anybody that applies will be accepted.
Okay. Again, there is one threshold of being qualified to be at the institution that is your admissions standards. But I've been telling people at community colleges for years that they too have admission standards. They're just not written into the academic standards that are there. And it goes back to otherwise qualified means with or without accommodation, they meet all of the same academic, technical, professional, and behavioral standards. When I started talking about all this stuff a long time ago, we didn't have students on the spectrum coming to college. As more students on the spectrum have come to college and have shown up and brought with them the concerns that come, it has to some extent complicated our lives because they are the exception to the rule. Because the rule has always been that you must meet the same behaviors that everyone else does, whether or not you have a disability. The fact that you have a disability may explain why you're engaging in certain behaviors, but it doesn't excuse it. And that's been our standard mantra for years. But the fact remains that to a certain extent, for the person on the spectrum, the behavior is the disability. And the question then becomes, is there a way to accommodate their behavior to bring them under the guise of acceptable behavior? In which case we would accommodate the behavior for a student on a spectrum. We wouldn't accommodate bad behavior for the student with an LD, with a learning disability, because the behavioral issues are not part of their disability. But it always comes back to whether they, with or without reasonable accommodation, they meet all of the same requirements. If your institution is saying, or if your Board of Regents is saying anyone who applies who's from within the state of South Dakota will be accepted, then you don't have academic qualifications, a high school diploma or a GED or whatever. But you still have rules regarding their performance, their behavior when they're on campus, and their in order to be an otherwise qualified student, you have to be participating in the academic program or participating in the college events without being disruptive to the education of others. And if you've got somebody who is being disruptive, they are not otherwise qualified to be there. And what that means is it's not up to you as a disability services provider to put them out, but it is it does mean that you don't have to provide accommodations for them because they're not otherwise qualified to be there. I feel like I'm talking in circles. Tell me what your questions are. Help me out here.
I didn't feel like you were talking in circles. I thought that was very informative, so.
Okay.
I would validate some of the thoughts that I guess that kind of
Right.
circulate in my own head.
Right.
That is kind of a circle type of a logic that goes on. I think. And maybe that's just validating that, okay, I'm not crazy. This is how it is.
Okay. That now back to your situation with the blind education major.
Yeah.
She is otherwise qualified to try. She may not be eligible to succeed because she doesn't have the skills. There may be some questions about technical standards that can and should be applied, not to keep her out of that situation, but she gets to go in and try. And if she can't meet the technical standards that have been set, including monitor the class for safety issues and provide appropriate feedback on an ongoing basis, etc. If she's not able to do the things that you need to do to effectively function in that internship or that student teaching experience, then she fails the student teaching experience. You don't drum her out of the Corps because she's blind and she can't do it. You say, this is what everybody who's in this experience is required to demonstrate in order to be successful, and you have not been able to demonstrate that. Now, you'd need to look to see whether there is a reasonable accommodation that can be made. And my experience specifically with students with disabilities in education is that there may be management techniques that the student can learn that will allow them to successfully function, for example, in a high school class, but could not successfully function, same student, in a first grade class. Because in a high school class, there are ways that students can bring other students in to help monitor activities, and there's a different level of behavior that is expected and is in place for all students, and you don't have the safety issues coming up in the same way. I'm thinking to a student who, a blind student who really wanted to teach little kids and was really good with little kids, but it was never going to happen because there were so many concerns, went on to be a very successful high school history teacher because he was really good with people and got figured out how to bring other people in on his disability and have them help him with what he needed. In other words, he created his own accommodations in the classroom. So I think it would behoove you to, or somebody, not you, somebody from the education department, maybe with you sitting in, behoove somebody to sit down with the student and say, we have concerns about how you will manage X, Y, and Z. And these are the things that we've observed to date. And if you can't find a way to manage these things or can't suggest something we can do to support you, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to pass this internship. We're not going to be able to pass you on. I think we talk all the time about the interactive process in the context of extended time and leniency and absence. You need an interactive process regarding this student and how she thinks she's going to manage in the classroom. But if the answer is she's leaving it up to you, or it'll be okay, it won't be okay. And then you deal with her as you would any other student who doesn't make the grade. You fail her.
So in this particular case, she had come to me prior to her field experience, and was like, oh, hey, so when do you think I should disclose my disability? And I was like, now, before you start. And
Wait, she said what? I'm sorry, what did she say?
asked, when should I disclose my disability? And I advised her, now, before you start, you need to let your folks know that you will need some accommodations. Apparently she did not do that. So she showed up to the first day, surprise, I'm blind. And so then that was also an issue. And so we were having conversations about advocacy and all of that. And then to make things, I think, a little bit more complicated, our education faculty are concerned about telling her she can't do something. Which I'm like, well, that's kind of doing her a disservice too. I think that if everyone's too afraid to tell her, like, these are the challenges that you're going to be facing, then none of us can help her if we're too afraid to have these hard conversations.
Again, there are ways and there are ways of saying things to people. If I were the education faculty, I wouldn't be saying to her, you can't do so and so and so and so. I would say to her, in order to be successful in this program, you will need to do X, Y, and Z. How are you going to do that?
Gotcha.
The challenge should be to her, not to restrict her, not to say we have no faith that you can do this, but rather to lay out what it is that they expect, not just of her, but of any student, and say, how are you going to manage this? And if she can't tell you how she's going to manage that, she doesn't get a chance to go further in the program.
Perfect.
Okay?
Now, what role, so when you're trying to figure out a situation when they're gonna be at the clinical side or to do this role, do you expect, as an accessibility service person, do I go to the site and check things out so that we can try to problem solve together? Or do I just push that to the student and the instructor to figure that out, and then if my services are needed in some way, then I come into play? That makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I'm trying to formulate an answer here. I think that's going to depend on the nature of the student's disability, the nature of the student's self-advocacy skills, your working relationship with the faculty in that department specifically, and how complicated you see the issues being for that student in that situation. You know, if it's an LD student who is going into a setting where they're going to be asked to chart at the end of their shift, and there are some questions about how they're going to manage that with their spelling problems, etc., I would sit the student down, rehearse with them what they're going to say and how they're going to do that, and then leave it to them to do on their own. If you have a deaf student going into a clinical rotation, and there are questions about the student's communication skills, this is a student who does pretty good one-on-one, but would need an interpreter in other kinds of situations, except interpreters may not be appropriate. Is there technology available today that they can use instead? In those circumstances, I would want to have a long discussion with the student and with faculty from that department about what typically goes on in that clinical setting. And then if you're still not sure together how it's going to work, you may actually have to go into the clinical setting and take a look at it yourself. But I think it depends on the nature of the disability, the student, the setting, again, your working knowledge of faculty. There's 2 times when I would get more involved. One would be when you have faculty who are really good at working with you and really want to see the students succeed and don't know how to go about it. And one would be the faculty who will take any excuse to drum this kid out of the core and is just waiting for a chance to say they can't make it, in which case you need to go in and say, this is how this should be done, in the same way we do in the classroom. So it's very individual in nature. I think you have to use your judgment as to when it's time to jump in.
Just to add my 2 cents to, if they're involved with SBBI or DRS, we can have them totally come in and do the AT assessment in that setting.
Okay.
So they can evaluate what tech is needed for that job, for that, whatever.
Okay,
That's great.
you're on my speed dial as of right now, so. Yeah.
So are there any times when it's just clear and obvious that a student's disability does disqualify them without going through all of the, you know, individual assessment?
Probably not. Probably not. Because otherwise qualified has to do with their meeting the same standards that everyone else is asked to meet. So it's not based on who the student is, it's based on what everybody else is asked to meet. And if what is set up for everybody else to meet is discriminatory, then the fact that the student doesn't meet those standards doesn't count. If the rules for everybody else are reasonable, appropriate, and logical, let's say, like admissions criteria that says they have to have at least a 2.5 GPA and a high school diploma, those are pretty standard criteria. And if this student has a disability and says, well, I've only got a 2.3 GPA, but that's because I'm learning disabled and so classes are harder for me, the answer is you are not an otherwise qualified person with a disability for this program because you don't meet the same requirements that we have for everybody else. So it's really based more on what everybody else is required to do, required to have, than it is on what this individual does or doesn't have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. What's next? I want to read you something. It's something that was on your list from yesterday about mental health diagnoses. And I tripped over something last night as I was writing something else that I wanted to pull out and read to you. The question I get asked a lot these days when I do these presentations is, how do you determine the difference between mental health concerns and a mental health disability? You know, when you have students applying for single rooms because of their mental health diagnosis, what does that really mean? And I'm reading to you from a last word post, again, those Friday blog posts that I do, from probably about a year ago. And there was an article about the huge increase in mental health concerns among college students, especially since COVID. And this expert was quoted as saying, the definition that seems to be around us in the culture, in the media, is one that equates being mentally healthy and feeling good or calm or relaxed or happy. Later, she states, the other side is that so much of the reporting around psychological impact of the pandemic, especially on young people, has conflated distress and mental health concerns. Those are 2 very different things. Distress is very much a part of life, and distress was an entirely appropriate response to the pandemic. But this is the quote that jumped out at me and that I think has real applicability to your making decisions. Experiences for college students are going to arrive in 3 categories. They're going to be enjoyable, we hope, uncomfortable, and sometimes unmanageable. Situations that are uncomfortable and unmanageable are not the same thing. A lot of undergraduate education will be uncomfortable because that means you're growing up. That means you're growing, right? That's part of being a student. If we introduce those categories, we may be able to help bring the temperature down around tolerating more discomfort. How many of the requests for single rooms that you deal with these days are because the student is uncomfortable with the idea of sharing their space or is uncomfortable about being around a roommate? How many of those requests are really for a single room versus a non-roommate room, a roommateless room? There's all sorts of stuff that you can read about the fact that we've got a whole lot more kids coming through now who never shared space at home, who come from families where they had their own room at home versus when we were growing up and a lot of us shared rooms with siblings along the way. But not only have they never shared a room before, but we're being asked to accommodate in housing, especially because they might have problems with a roommate rather than because they have a problem that is exacerbated by a roommate, but rather it might happen. We don't make accommodations for learning disabled students because they might have trouble with a test. We make accommodations if we know that this is the function limitation. So anything that talks about potential for problems, to me, is not a strong case for a single room. To go with that, I think we talked about this in part yesterday, but the tendency these days of us to get documentation that says this is what the student needs in response to their mental health problems, and if you don't give it, their mental health problems will be worse. We were never meant to be part of treatment. And if they're telling you that this has to happen or the problem will be exacerbated, the answer is that may be true, but that's not the purpose of accommodations. Accommodations are not part of treatment. They are to support students who are there now. And we've got to start being more comfortable ourselves in sorting out what is, the statistics say that something like 35% of the students on campus these days report mental health concerns. But you're not seeing 35% of the student body in your office. So at some point along the line, there is a difference between even now what they define as mental health concerns versus disability. We need to be better at helping them sort that out. And I like that distinction of situations that are enjoyable, situations that are uncomfortable, and situations that are unmanageable. The unmanageable ones are the ones where we may want to seriously consider single rooms. Does that make sense?
Your computer for us.
Can I what?
One of our attendees on
Oh,
Zoom
okay.
needs to mute. Kirsten, if you can hear me, you're not muted. So that leads me to, be more comfortable sorting it out, but also what type of documentation helps with sorting this out, and how do we, and I feel like we go back to how we are dealing with our ESA requests, more information. Okay. And that is definitely, you've really got that on board with me now, but I get so much from medical doctors, God love them, medical professionals, even after a one-time visit in an urgent care. A certified nurse practitioner with no designations in the area of mental health, claiming that these people need these accommodations. Do we then just take that as a piece of evidence and do the student interview? I mean, where can we really take that professional documentation at face value?
If you were looking at documentation of a learning disability that came from the medical doctor, would you accept it?
No,
Why?
because it doesn't have a full evaluation of how that impacts their academics.
But this is a credible individual who is appropriately licensed in their field, and they're telling you that this student is LD. Why aren't you willing to accept their statement?
They're probably not qualified to diagnose it.
Thank you. Exactly. Because they're not qualified to diagnose a learning disability.
And that's
If you are talking about an urgent care nurse or a one-time visit to urgent care or whatever, who is saying on the basis of that one visit, this individual has a mental health disability and will need whatever, my response would be, we appreciate the input, but you are not qualified to make the diagnosis of a substantial limitation on the basis of the information provided. We are more than happy to accept more information supporting this, but we are not prepared to make the accommodation based on what you've given us thus far. The issue, it's funny because I teach a whole class called How to Just Say No. But in this case, what I would suggest is that you don't say no, you say not now. You learn to say, based on the information you have provided to date, we do not see the need to provide the accommodation you've requested. If more information becomes available from an appropriate source who has more knowledge of your concerns, we are more than happy to reevaluate. You don't have to say no. You say not now. And I think you should feel comfortable in doing so if, in your best estimation, the information provided to date is not credible in establishing that this is a person with a disability.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I needed. I don't know about you guys.
So what about the physician that is the student's family physician that they have worked with for the last whatever, versus, you know, an ER visit? How would you?
Okay, the question, again, you have to know your audience, or not your audience, but your constituents at this point in time. If I was dealing with a student who came from a large urban area where there were lots of resources available, regardless of financial considerations, you know, between the school districts and whatever, and they brought me a letter from their family doctor, from their pediatrician, saying this student has a mental health disability. I've known him for years. I would probably say, if it's rising to the level of disability, why have they not seen someone who is a specialist in that area? I would not expect the local pediatrician to be treating them for a mental health disability if they come from an environment where there were lots of other resources available. If you are talking about somebody who is from rural South Dakota, I have to assume that rural South Dakota is like rural Ohio or rural Indiana, both of which I have a fair amount of knowledge of. And in those communities, the doctor may be the only one they have access to. And their family doctor may in fact be treating them for mental health issues and prescribing medication and whatever, because there's nobody else around to do it. So I think it comes back to not the credentials of the individual, but their level of information, not just how long have you known this patient, but what makes you think that this is a substantial problem for the student? What have you experienced? What has the student experienced over time? What have you done to help to support the student over time? Really, a lot of the questions that are on the ESA form that we talked about yesterday could be useful in going back to the family physician to ask for more information about establishing a mental health problem, if that's the concern along the way. But I think it's as Jennifer said, I think we've got to come back to the quality of the information provided and worry less about who it's coming from.
So quickly, I guess, I know we're running low on time. I have a situation in Northern where our team doctor, who is a sports doctor, is prescribing Adderall and things like that for ADHD and providing those types of things. And are now also sending letters saying that this person needs accommodations because of attention deficit, but they're an orthopedic surgeon. How would you approach that?
Very specific situation within your own institution, and my approach to that would probably be, this is not the hill I want to die on. If that team physician is willing to potentially jeopardize their professional licensure by prescribing outside their area of expertise, I don't want to be the one to call them and point fingers. Within the institution, it's just not worth it. If in fact they are prescribing Adderall for the kid and they feel that it's there, I would go with, if this is what the team physician who is part of this institution has said, I'm not going to buck it. I'm just going to give the kid the accommodations. Keep in mind, to some extent, that comes back to some of the accommodations that we make for students with ADHD and learning disabilities specifically are pretty benign accommodations, in that if the kid doesn't really need them, they're not really going to help them. You know, we get into this argument all the time when it comes to students with learning disabilities and how much time is enough time. The studies all show that you either know the information or you don't. And if you are a student who does not have a learning disability given extended time, they're not going to do significantly better. If it's a student who does have a learning disability given extended time, they may do significantly better. It's a benign accommodation to a large extent. In the specific situation you described, where you've got a doctor internal to the institution, already part of the system, who is prescribing medication, even if you have every reason to believe they shouldn't be, I wouldn't argue. I'd let it go.
And that's kind of the stance I've taken on it, because one, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have that training. I will just have to trust him. And you're right, it is a benign accommodation. There is the whole ethics thing, but it's outside of mine. That's on him. And it started coming up because actually this one student was stealing another student's Adderall, and so as opposed to getting in trouble, the student went to the doctor to get a prescription for it. And the doctor was like, here you go. Yeah, so many things.
You don't want to be the one to blow the whistle. If there's hinky things going on, stay out of it. You don't want to be the one to point fingers and just, this is not the hill you want to die on. You've got more important things to worry about.
I will wash that of my consciousness. Thanks.
There you go.
I'm cleansed.
I'm not saying no worries about.
Crazy.
Oh, sorry.
Why do I get so stuck on ethical stuff though? I mean, I sit here and I'm like,
Because we're good people.
I'm just, and so, yeah, don't die on that hill, Jen, but also, are you kidding me? Why are we allowing this to happen? Disgusting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't have a good answer for that either.
Oh.
Okay. Back to the mental health diagnosis and the single accommodations. We've got a little bit of time yet, and I can go slightly over if you need me to, but let's talk about this. The question asked was, if a student is approved for a single room as a university, can we charge for the single room? And the answer is probably not, but only probably not. If it is approved as an accommodation, the standard rule of thumb is that you cannot charge the student for an accommodation. So just as you don't charge the student for paying for their own interpreters if it's a deaf student, you don't charge the student for paying for a single room if it's a student who needs that single room because of their disability. Except that rule, as it regards housing, came down in the mid-80s, might even have been earlier than that, the case that I'm thinking of. And it's the only case out there, and it's the one everybody quotes, and it came down at a point in time where almost all residence halls were set up to be double rooms with a roommate and a bathroom down the hall. And when they said, if the student needs the single room, the student involved in the case that was the landmark case, if you will, the student involved was a quadriplegic student who needed attendant care and had an attendant coming and going and had all of this extra equipment to get him in and out of bed, etc. needed a single room in order to be able to function in the dorm. And they said, you cannot charge the student for a single room when in fact he needs that single room in order to participate in your residential program. Except that in this day and age, think about all of the different housing options on your campus. You've got residence halls that are traditional double rooms, bathroom down the hall, and then you've got small suites where there's 2 rooms with doubles and they share a bathroom. And there are big suites with more, you know what the options are on your individual campus, but there's all these other options. And you have some residence halls that are air conditioned and some that are not. And the students who choose to be in the air conditioned residence halls pay extra to be in those air conditioned residence halls. What are you going to do if if the only single room you have available is in the fancier dorm with the air conditioning? Do they pay the extra piece of the fee that comes with being in that dorm? And the answer is there are no good answers. The institution has to make a decision as to how it wants to proceed and be consistent in their application of the rules. And again, as far as I'm concerned, you let the chips fall where they may. If the issue is strictly this student is approved for a single room, we have some single rooms that students can choose to take as their room assignment. And if they choose to take it as a room assignment, then they pay extra for that single room. In those cases, I would not charge the student who gets it as an accommodation as if they were in a single. I would charge them as if they were in a double. But when you get into all of the miscellaneous configurations, what happens if you've got a student who is going to have a single room in one of those 2-room suites with a bathroom in between? Do you charge them as if they were in a standard double, or do you charge them as if they were in half of the double that's got the bathroom in between? It varies with the kind of housing that they're into. And we don't have any good answers right now. You have to use your best judgment.
So that's consistent with the way we do at Beach. It depends on the hall.
Yeah.
And the price structures within each hall, and then what single becomes available.
Yeah.
And if they truly require the single and we only have a single in a specific hall, that's where they're placed. So we've run into some stuff, but we won't get into those details, but.
And you just figure it out as you go along.
Yeah, and those when we're getting in a better situation now, but we were over capacity for a couple of years there. Not a bad thing to be, for our residents' life, but we didn't have readily available singles, so they went on to a waiting list where we had a singles waiting list, but those with accommodations were pushed to the top of that list, and we accommodated from there.
Again, my experience is you don't get in trouble for thinking through what you can do and having a good reason for making the decisions you did. You get in trouble for being arbitrary and capricious or for following the rule blindly because it's the rule. You were hired to think on behalf of the institute and help the institution meet its responsibilities. You were not entitled to be infallible. The only thing I can tell you is standard rule of thumb: never surprise your supervisor. If the decision that you're making is one that could be called into question for whatever reason, then up front at the point where you are about to make the decision, you sit down with your supervisor and you decide how far up that supervisor should be and say, this is what the situation is. This is my decision based on this, this, and this. This is what I'm planning to say unless you tell me otherwise. And if they tell you otherwise, do it their way.
Yep. Agreed.
Okay. All right, I'll tell you what. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if there was no other questions on that, Was there something quick that you could talk about? There was conversation with regard to the access v success model.
Okay. Access versus success comes back to a philosophy, a discussion of philosophy behind disability services. I am old enough to have come from a civil rights perspective, an equal access perspective when it comes to disability services. Because when I got in the field, that's all there was. All this other stuff has come since then. We were always taught at the beginning that the purpose of accommodations is to provide equal access for students with disabilities. We hope that all students will be successful, but we do not provide accommodations for purposes of fostering success. We provide accommodations for purposes of assuring full access to whatever the activities are. If you come from that kind of a perspective, then when it comes down to making hard decisions about saying yes or no regarding a specific accommodation request, part of your decision-making schema may be to say, what would this accommodation accomplish? Why is this accommodation being requested? And if the answer is the student will be more successful if they have X, Y, or Z, my response would be, that's not why we provide an accommodation. If the answer is the student doesn't have a chance to show what they can do unless this is in place, they don't have an equal opportunity to show their abilities, then that's about access. If you think in terms of extended time on a test, why do we give extended time to students with certain kinds of disabilities? And the answer is because we have determined that without the extended time, they wouldn't have an equal chance to show what everybody else has a chance to show in terms of their own, their mastery of the information or the skill. So sometimes evaluating what it is that everybody else has access to helps you make decisions about an accommodation, because if it's an accommodation that if it's an area that everybody else has access to in the same way that the student with the disability does, then there may be no accommodation that is necessary. If the student is saying, I can't do this without the extra, that sounds like success-oriented to me. If they're saying, I'll do better if I have this, that sounds like success-oriented to me. If they're saying, I will not be able to manage this task or perform in this activity without this, now I'm getting down to access. I can't do what they can do. The difference between providing Braille to a blind student, that's access. That's access because the blind student can't read standard print to do with it what everybody else can do with standard print. So providing Braille is an access issue. When it comes down to, or when it's something like, the classic example has always been tutoring. The student who says, because of my learning disability, I need more help explaining these concepts to me, I need a tutor. The answer is tutoring is a personal service. It is by definition a success-oriented service. Tutoring is not a required service because it's not about access, it's about success. And again, I feel like I'm talking off the top of my head and I'm talking in circles. Is that helping at all?
That's helping. for sure.
Okay.
So our learning center on our campus is amazing. I mean, they're just amazing. What I'm just learning now, because I'm brand new to the field area, is that the learning disabilities, which I actually have on the letter that they receive when they get their accommodations, states clearly that the ARC is an access to all students, and it's, you know, their responsibility to take ownership of learning strategies, note taking, things like that. I have that actually on the letter, because it's like all access, so that, because I'm getting a lot of requests for private tutors from the high school. Like they need someone to take notes for them, that kind of thing. So I'm like, we don't do that at the college level. That's not what we do. You're gonna have to learn how to do the note taking if you're going to be able to work in a field, to take instructions from your boss, that kind of a thing. We put it into the work field relations. So, and I just added that part. My predecessors didn't have that on the letter. So when I'm getting a special request of someone who has higher needs for an aide in the class or things like that, I don't know how to accommodate that or if I should be accommodating. And I just realized I have a full room right here that could probably answer that question for me, but it just popped into my head as you guys were talking about.
Okay, are you saying, give me an example of somebody who would need an aide with them?
I just have an incoming student and I just got the paperwork before I left campus, is that this individual has always had an aide in the classroom taking notes, reading the test to them, and they're wanting that same accommodation at the post-secondary level.
What's their disability?
It's just low functioning disabilities for reading comprehension and processing, really, just processing.
I would say that's not an accommodation we make at the college level.
I can just go back to extended time for a
Okay.
test, which will give him that extra time to read and process. Right?
Because the answer is, it's what you already said. Everybody else is expected to manage on their own with the kinds of tasks that they are asking for somebody else to manage for them. At the high school level, the emphasis that actually you can bring it back to a discussion of the, you just reminded me of something I can send you. You can bring it back to a discussion of the difference between IDEA and Section 504. IDEA by definition is about success. And so the accommodations that were provided to the student in the K-12 situation were meant to foster success for those students. But at the college level, we're all about equal access under the law. And for that reason, many of the accommodations that they were given before do not translate to the higher ed level.
Does that also
Okay.
translate into the whole modification versus accommodation?
Yeah, depending on what terminology is being used in your state as far as that's concerned. I just had this discussion with one of my classes the other day. Do they use 504 plans in the K-12 system in South Dakota?
IEP and 504, yep.
They do have 504 plans. Okay. You very often get into situations where people don't understand when we say we operate on the basis of 504 and they say, well, he's on a 504 plan or he had this kind. IEPs are required under federal law under IDEA. 504 plans are not. 504 plans are a bastardization that have been adopted at some state levels because they have kids who, for whatever reason, the IEP process doesn't apply to them, but they have disabilities and they need something extra. And so they've decided to call it a 504 plan instead. And they go through the same process that they do, but that's at the state level. That's not part of the federal law. I'm in Ohio, and in Ohio, if the kid needs academic accommodations, they are on an IEP. If they need other support because of a disability, they're on a 504 plan. So my daughter, who has cerebral palsy and needed physical therapy and occupational therapy while she was in school and speech therapy, she was on a 504 plan, not an IEP. But that's because the way the state of Ohio chooses to work with it. The bottom line is either one of those don't carry over to the K-12 level or to the higher education level. And you have to make that distinction along the way. Tell you what I'm going to do. I am going to I'll send it to Dan and assume that he can get it out to all of you. I'm going to send you 2 letters. One is a letter that I wrote 15 years ago when my daughter was getting ready to go away to school. It's called An Open Letter to Parents of a Student with a Disability. And it is something that you can use as you go into the interviewing situation with new parents and new students coming in over the summer. It's a way of explaining to parents where their responsibilities how their responsibilities have ended. The biggest problem is that in the K-12 system under IDEA, nothing can be done for, to, or with a student without parental permission. When they get to college, parents have no rights legally in the process of interacting with you regarding the student's accommodation. So they've gone from having total control over the process to having no legal input at all. And everybody knows that the difference between a high school senior and a college freshman is 3 months. It is at least as much of a problem for the parents as it is for the students to make that switch. And this letter talks about how you can, talks about the changes that need to happen and why. And it comes from somebody who was a parent themselves rather than coming from a professional lecturing to them about what's there. I'll send you a copy of that. It's been out there for 15 years, and I encourage people, you can put it on your website, you can make copies of it and hand it to people along the way. You can send it out to parents as you're making appointments for coming in for intake. You can do whatever you want. You can sleep with it under your pillow if you want. But it's there and available if you need it. The second letter is one that doesn't go out all, that not everybody has seen. That the first letter was written about this time in May of the year that Connie was getting ready to go away to college. The second letter was written in August, just before classes started. And it is written not to the parents, but to the disability services providers. And it's a reminder that when you start going through that process with new students, you have been through that process dozens of times before, and you will be going through it dozens of times over the summer with new parents and new students as they come in. For the parent that is sitting across from you, it's their first time. And what comes easily to you doesn't necessarily come easily or feel comfortable to them. And it's a request that you please be kind. And it came from a parent at that point in time. Okay, I'll send those to Dan as soon as we get off. Anything else urgent that I can tell you now?
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. I hope it was helpful. Oh, you know what? I meant to say this at the beginning and I forgot. You are not seeing things. For those of you who say, that's not what she looked like yesterday. I had a haircut last night after I talked to you. I was going to mention that and then I forgot all about it until just now. But yes, we used to take my dog in to get shaved at the beginning of every summer. All right. Take care, everybody. You know where to find me. JaneJarrow@AOL.com. Don't be strangers. Take care. Bye-bye.
The second letter is to remind us to be kind to us,
Yeah.
Because though we've done this a million times and it's duh, to the parent across